Hi everyone. I'm going to talk a little bit today about the Yellow Wallpaper, which is actually the last story in our short story unit. It is by Charlotte Perkins Gilman, and the publication date is 1892. You can see Charlotte Perkins Stetson is actually the author on this particular cover, and that was after she had been divorced from her husband. Um, Speaking of husband, this story has autobiographical elements. So the very thing that happened to the unnamed narrator in the story happened to Charlotte Perkins Gilman herself. She did go through these experiences, and she was shunted off to have the rest cure and the treatment from the particular doctor, Weir Mitchell, who is mentioned in the story. Don't forget, though, that Gilman has created a persona. So it is the implied author rather than Charlotte Perkins Gilman herself, who is the narrator of the story. Okay, we have an unnamed first person narrator. She's probably in her 20s. We know she just had a baby, and most new mothers in the 1890s were in their 20s. She is deemed to have a, quote, nervous condition. And what is that nervous condition? We now know and can call that nervous condition postpartum depression, that in her case turns into postpartum psychosis. Now, postpartum depression is common, and it often does not turn into the kind of psychosis that she experiences. However, in 1892, she would not have been diagnosed with that. It was considered in that time just a nervous condition, or women were hysterical, or they had some kind of anxious mental illness. There were no medicines, there were no doctors who understood this yet. And so, what she was forced to do was be confined in her particular room most of the time as a rest condition, or a rest cure, excuse me. That is what her husband, who we'll talk about in a little bit, deems as the best cure for this. Um, Hysteria would have been another word that doctors at the time used to define and describe these mental conditions. She is occasionally allowed to go out for fresh air, but she's always watched by someone, either her husband, John, or Jenny, who is his sister and her caretaker in the story. She writes this story, the narrator does, as a journal on the sly. We know from throughout the story that she occasionally writes. It makes her tired, not because she's physically tired, but because she's mentally and emotionally and psychiatrically tired. And she must hide this, or else they would take away the pencil and paper that she has somehow procured that enables her to write. Other characters in the story: John, of course, is her husband. He's a physician. He thinks he's helping her with his tonics, his, quote, rest cure, which deems her to have no work or creative activity. Everybody looks to him for authority, and his authority would be deemed final in that time as a man and as a doctor. And it's also mentioned once that the narrator's brother is also a physician, and he agreed to what John was supposedly curing her with. He treats her, however, like a child, like a juvenile. He makes her childlike in the assertions toward her. He calls her darling, dear. He chides her. He carries her up to bed. He says, bless her little heart. He says, for example, you are really getting better, dear, whether you can see it or not. I am a doctor, dear, and I know. She replies, My appetite may be better in the evening when you are here, but it is worse in the morning when you are away. And his reply to her is, bless her little heart. He's not even speaking to someone else. He uses the pronoun her instead of your. And he dismisses anything that she says because, of course, his word is final. Jenny is her husband's sister. She may be misnamed Jane in the final lines of the story. So Jenny is not the narrator. The narrator does not have a name throughout the story. And there's a possibility that because in the final lines of the story, the narrator has finally gone over the edge in terms of her psychosis, that she just called her Jane. Perhaps she's forgotten her name because she finally has given into the psychosis. Others suggest that Jane is actually the narrator. And what this might suggest is that the narrator's sane part of her mind disappears slowly over the course of the summer and over the course of the story, which would make sense. That sane part would be Jane, and the insane or the psychosis laden part has finally taken over her persona. If we look at the last page of the story on page 313 in the last few lines, she says, I kept on creeping just the same, but I looked at him over my shoulder. I've got out at last, said I, in spite of you and Jane, and I've pulled off most of the paper so you can't put me back. So if Jane is not Jenny and Jane is her, then Jane would be perhaps the sane part of her that is trying to hang on to sanity, that's trying to hang on to her real self. But in that final line, she says, in spite of Jane, in spite of you, my husband, and in spite of my old self, I actually am out now. And in our minds, we know that she's given into the psychosis. Ironically, at the end, this narrator then finds freedom at the core of insanity. What is she doing at the very end? She says, he did, and right across my path by the wall so that I had to creep over him every time. She is actually crawling on the floor. Her shoulder is making a, quote, smooch in the wall as she crawls around the floor because the wallpaper color is coming off into her shoulder. So those are the other characters and some of the ideas of the story as well. Now we'll talk a little bit about setting. It is a, quote, haunted house. She calls it that. And people originally saw this story as a story about almost a horror story, a story like A Rose for Emily in many ways, that has a haunted house, that has something wrong with the place where these women are, quote, confined and living. It is a large home in the country. It's somewhat dilapidated. It's on beautiful grounds, but it has odd characteristics. She and John's bedroom used to be a playroom or a nursery of some kind with yellow wallpaper. And she, at one point, says she's glad that her baby doesn't have to live in this nursery. She wants to move to a different room, but her husband said, oh no, this one has more light. This one has room for 2 beds, his bed and her bed. They can share the room, etc. And so the yellow wallpaper and her own psychosis slowly contribute to drive her insane, as well as the rest cure that's been deemed as what will cure her illness. And ironically, of course, she's forced to spend most of her time in this room, which is not allowing her to get better. The yellow wallpaper itself, the color and design of the yellow wallpaper in the nursery and in her room where she lives captivates the narrator. It captures her. It's the only thing that she's allowed to focus on because there's nothing else there. All of the old remnants of the nursery, she says there are rings in the wall. So it would have been like a nursery turned into a playroom for probably young boys who would play around at that time. There would be metal rings and just different things that a large room would house, kind of like an old gym. Um, Yellow in this story symbolizes disgust, horror, and something repellent, ironically, as we normally picture yellow as something bright and sunny and beautiful. She mentions the designs quite a lot in the story. How the design doesn't seem to have a pattern or symmetry. She calls the eyes bulbous. She says it looks like a fungus at some points. And I think, in my mind, at least, my interpretation is that these different designs are reminiscent of the chaos of her mind. The um, what she's seeing in the wallpaper is, of course, not really there. And she sees a woman in the wallpaper, which, of course, we find out that the woman is herself. Without being able to write, read, or see anybody or do anything, without stimulation from others, um, she falls off into insanity. Some say that the wallpaper perhaps is parallel with paper of another sort, the journal paper that she uses to compose her thoughts. Both papers representing two things at once, ambiguously: confinement and escape, freedom and imprisonment. She sees a pattern in the wallpaper, including bars on the wallpaper itself, which are like the bars on the actual windows. We have two sets of bars that are actually confining her into the house. She then is the woman trapped behind the wallpaper that she sees. Her other self, if we're going to call her Jane, the woman who is not Jane, the new self that is becoming psychotic as a result of not getting better. Her other self who's anxious to get out because she feels trapped. And the only way she can get out of something that's literally physically confining her is to become insane, to give in to that portion of her mind. There are several examples of foreshadowing in the story that once we get to the end, we can go back and trace them. So from the very beginning, the narrator discusses paint and paper stripped off the wall. Now, it could have been stripped off from the beginning, of course. There could be pieces stripped off, but perhaps she started stripping it off herself from the very beginning, as we know that she does throughout the story, because it has so many negative uh, things that she feels as she's looking at the wallpaper. The floor is scratched and gouged and splintered. Of course, at the beginning, we think that's only because she, or only because the playroom was like that from the beginning. But we know at the very end that she actually gnawed on the bed at one point. So she could have been doing this the entire time. Near the end, she says, "I always lock the door when I creep by daylight." Now, the word creep in this story means crawl. So we have to understand that they are synonymous. She is physically crawling. Um, she crawls outside. When she goes outside, when she's allowed out, she talks about crawling and then hiding when somebody comes by. So all of these things are small pieces of foreshadowing that we can look back on and see, yes, this is what actually happened to her. And it all makes sense as the story moves along at a fairly slow pace, but with a lot of detail about how we're understanding this. And then finally, themes. We've talked about this one: freedom and escape versus incarceration, both literally and metaphorically, in her mind and in the room. It is a plea for new treatments of women's depression and anxiety. There is a gender gap in the medical community. And this story, once it was published, actually was one of the first things in writing where people in the community saw how wrong these, quote, rest cures with only tonics were, not allowing women any kind of creative or mental freedom, was ironically causing them to get worse. And this is the type of story that helped propel forward new things. in reality. So this is what literature can do sometimes. Um, it can help move forward society, and it can help progress into new ideas that assist and help people. It is a commentary on marriage in upper middle class 19th century America, primarily white America, how the husband is in charge and his authority reigns supreme, even though he loves his wife. There's no doubt that he loves his wife, but he doesn't listen to her, as men did not listen to women's pleas of desperation. And that is how we can understand what's happening in this story. And finally, a general misunderstanding of mental illness and how it grows. She was depressed after having a baby. That's a normal hormonal physical reaction that many women get. No one understood that at the time, least of all men. Women did understand it, but they had no authority or power in the community and in society in order to change anything. And this is one of the first steps toward that. So, anyway, that's it for the Yellow Wallpaper and 4 short stories. Be sure you check all of the PowerPoints in this week, as well as in the literary research paper in coming weeks, so that you can begin to write your paper after you pick a story. All right, bye bye.